This is the tale of Mormon saints and sinners, from our roots until present day. Saddle up.
Gird your loins, lock your hearts, and pay your tithing, because we're bringing you the story of Mormonism in all its paradisiacal glory.
It's the Sunstone History Podcast.
Well, I've sinned so gravely, brother Brigham, brother Young. I've sinned so gravely, brother Young.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the Sunstone History Podcast. Got a very unique episode today. We're stepping out of early Utah for a minute due to a very important new book that was just published. We're very happy to have our good friend Matt Harris here with us. Matt, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Brian. Thank you.
This is an interview and a book we've been looking forward to for a long time. So, Matt Harris is a professor of history and the coordinator of the legal studies program at CSU Pueblo. Matt is the author of several books, and I, of course, am pulling these off the shelves here at Benchmark Books, which is a fine place to get them all. So, very much on topic, Mormon Church and Blacks, a documentary history that you did with Newell Bringhurst, and then two books on Ezra Taft Benson. Got Watchman on the Tower, Ezra Taft Benson and the Making of the Mormon Right, and Thunder from the Right, Ezra Taft Benson in Mormonism and Politics. And then another book with Newell Bringhurst, the LDS Gospel Topic Series, The Scholarly Engagement. And then all of that leads us to our book for today, just released from Oxford, Second Class Saints, Black Mormons, and the Struggle for Racial Equality. And this is so exciting. I mean, I've known you for quite a while now. In fact, I was going to ask you, when would you guess the first time you came into Benchmark was?
Oh my goodness. Probably during one of my early visits to the U researching. So maybe 2011, 2012, maybe?
2013. Yep.
Oh, close. Okay.
Yep.
Good memory.
And I thought it was so interesting. The first thing that you bought here was the working draft of Ed Kimball's book, Lengthen Your Stride. I thought, that's pretty on brand. So,
which is right behind me still.
So over these 10 plus years that I've known Matt now, almost every conversation that we've had has touched on your work for this book, and at least some. Oh, such an important book. And I appreciate that it's also very well written. I talk to people all the time about how a lot of times you have historians and you have writers. You don't usually have both. So to have a book that is this well researched and this well done is very nice.
Thanks, Brian.
And of course, this is a very troubling, this is a very painful story. And the best way to deal with it is to understand. And one of the things that I appreciate you too, Matt, is that you are a digger. And that is a skill that I feel like we are losing to some degree. And it's so sad because in a digital world, we have access to more sources than ever. It's so easy to get to them. And so I appreciate that you put the work in the trenches. So many of our conversations have been about your research trips to all these different places. And so it's been very interesting to hear your story of how you got this material. So Matt, give us a brief overview of this book. What were you trying to do in Second Class?
Well, before I get to that, Brian, I want to say what a pleasure it's been to come to Utah, go into the archives, and then oftentimes I'd visit Benchmark after a long day's work. And you and poor Chris and poor Kurt had to listen to me talk about my finds that day. And I was fresh on my mind. So anyway, you guys were, for many of these research discoveries, you guys were there from the ground up. So that was always fun to talk to you about what I learned that day in the archives when I visited Benchmark. All right. So what I want to do in this book is a couple things. I knew that nobody had ever written this story from the 20th and 21st centuries. There are previous LDS authors and writers had just touched on these events, but never a deep dive. And I wanted to do a deep dive. And the 19th century has been superbly done by other scholars of history. Paul Reeve has done a wonderful book about the origins of the band. Russell Stevenson has done some great work. And of course, my good friend Newell Bringhurst sort of set the stage in 1981 when he published his seminal book, Saints, Slaves, and Blacks. But their focuses were mostly on the 19th century with forays into the 20th and 21st century. And I really want to go to do a deep dive. But to do that, I needed sources. And so when I got access to President Kimball's private papers, including his diaries, and also Joseph Fielding Smith's papers and Hugh B. Brown's papers, Ezra Taft Benson's, some Bruce McConkie papers, I knew that it would be possible to do this.
And as any historian who's tried to work on 20th century Mormon history knows, is getting those sources can be very difficult. And as you learned, certainly archival sources were very important, but also so many of those sources were in private hands. And how did you go about the private side of it? How did those negotiations work?
Brian, that is top secret, and I cannot reveal that. No, these are great questions. You know, we often go to history conferences, and we scholars lament that most of the journals are full of 19th century research topics on Mormonism. And we lament that there's not more in the 20th and 21st centuries. So we know it's a problem, but the problem is one of sourcing. And a lot of these sources are closed off, particularly institutional documents of the church, and also the private papers and diaries of many of the brethren. Those are shut off in Salt Lake. And so it's been hard to really fulfill that niche, to move into that gap without proper source work. And my book does that. And there's a few things I'll share with you on that question. One is that when there's a diary that you want to see at the church archives that isn't open or they won't let you see, I've gone to the family members. And I would simply say, you know, my name is Matt Harris. I'm researching this book. And can I have your father's diaries? No, you know, you have to finesse it, right? No one's going to give you the jewels of the family to some stranger. So jokes aside, I've had to cultivate, nurture relationships. And, you know, they have to trust you that whatever they give you will be used responsibly and ethically and wisely. And so I've worked really hard to earn the trust of the kids of general authorities. I say kids, these are adults in their 60s and 70s. But they are the custodians of their late father's papers. And so I've worked hard to gain that trust. And I've had several people over the years, most of whom are scholars, ask me, you know, hey, I saw you quote this diary that's not accessible anywhere. Can I have it? And my first response is no. I can't give that to you. It was entrusted to me. You'll have to reach out to the family and get their permission. And so I'm able to maintain that trust because I don't share. And so that's one way that I get sources. I do go through the Church History Library. They've been very generous with me over the years, so I'm grateful for their support. The other source that I get that's probably the biggest secret, and that is the people who work for the church education system people, BYU religion professors. Back in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, it wasn't uncommon for a CES teacher to call up President so-and-so, you know, the prophet, and say, hey, I'm going to be in town next Monday at 10. Can I drop in? And, you know, the president would say, sure, love to talk to you. One can imagine that happens today for a lot of different reasons. But so when that happens, usually the educators in question, they have a problem or a difficulty with a doctrine or some matter that they want the church president to weigh in on. And so they would drop in, let's use one example, evolution. In the early 1950s, there were a number of CES people that just absolutely despised Joseph Fielding Smith's book on his anti-evolution book. And so they went to the church president, and President McKay granted them an audience and listened to their concerns. And he basically said, Brother Smith's views are not the views of the church. We're hearing you. We're not going to allow his book to be used in the church's seminaries and institutes curriculum. Now, one can imagine these CS people going back saying, mission accomplished, mission accomplished. But they write about these episodes with the president. And these become important primary documents where you get a bird's eye view of what's going on behind the scenes that you wouldn't get today. So I've mined all of the relevant CES and BYU religion papers collections at both the U of U and BYU. And I found so many remarkable gems in those private collections.
Reading through your notes, it's just an amazing array of sources. And that's part of the reason that the book is so interesting, is because you were able to access those nuts and bolts that make the history sing. And then people would see that as they read it. Well, if we're going to talk about how a ban was lifted, we better talk about how a ban was started. So let's talk about the origins of the temple and priesthood ban. Where does it actually come from?
Well, the church, I think, I want to give I hope not an academic answer, but I think it's an important one. For years, the church has argued that since 1969, they've argued that we don't know why the ban began. And that's a throwaway line, because when they first created that line in the 1960s, it was during a very heated time in American history, very heated time in church history. This is with the civil rights movement, the church taking all kinds of guff over their racial doctrine. And so they recognized right away that the traditional rationales for the ban, i.e. that Black people bear this biblical curse, that they're less valiant and or neutral in the pre-existence, these are really, really hard to explain to a journalist who's asking, now, why can't Black people in your church hold the priesthood? And you're giving them some pedantic reason from an obscure Book of Mormon scripture called Abraham, where there's a war in heaven, and, that doesn't fly with people. So they learned that in 1969, they ought not to give those traditional rationales. And so the reason was that it's never been revealed, we don't know. Well, that's not a sustainable line, as I suspect the leaders knew, because for decades, Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce McConkie, the two biggest purveyors of Mormon racial teachings, they knew very definitively why the ban occurred. It's because of this curse and this pre-existent behavior. So, but even going back before that, the Brethren had learned, they had looked in the late 19th, early 20th century, they had looked for a revelation from founding prophet Joseph Smith Jr., trying to tie the ban into some kind of revelatory decree, and they couldn't find one. They talk about this among themselves. Where's the revelation? And they speculate it was the prophet Joseph Smith, because everything else from the Restoration appeared to come from him. And we know that's not true. Doctrine evolves, right? But that was the whole idea, that he was the great prophetic figure of the Restoration, and therefore he must have given us the racial doctrine as well. But what the evidence overwhelmingly points to is that it began in 1852 with Brigham Young. And scholars have known about this for a very, very long time, ever since Lester Bush's seminal article and dialogue in 1973, which I'm sure we can dive into and maybe later. But the Brethren have stuck with this idea that it was Joseph Smith's as the origin. And what we've learned from recent scholarship, and I talk about this in my book too, is that it didn't just come from Brigham Young in 1852. It was also the result of interracial marriages by and among some Black Latter-day Saints Black men who had married white women. And what's really extraordinary about this story is that Brigham Young had met with one of these Black men, a guy by the name of William McCary. He identified as both Native American and Negro, as they said in those days. And McCary had complained to Brigham Young on one occasion that the Saints weren't treating him really well. And the subtext to that is the guy was pontificating on all kinds of strange doctrines like reincarnation, polygamy, that he was to be with these white women in order to solidify the union, they had to have sex. He was really out there. But before Brigham Young knew this, he was compassionate to McCary when McCary went in and said, hey, look, they're discriminating against me. And Young basically said that, hey, that's not right. That's wrong. And we have a colored man in Massachusetts who's a priesthood holder, and he's a good elder in the church. So he's giving McCary encouragement. And then about, months after he meets with McCary giving him encouragement, Brigham Young does a an about face. And the reason why he does an about face is because he learns in that period that the elder from Massachusetts and McCary have now taken polygamous white wives. And we read in the Journal of Discourse and other places where Young talks about the viciousness of interracial marriage, that it would require both the black man and the white woman to give up their life in order to satisfy the sin. So this is blood atonement. And what's driving this ban are these interracial marriages that Young learns about.
The McCary episode is so fascinating. And once people finish your book, if they still have the itch, Real Native Genius about his story and his wife's story, Lucy Stanton, fascinating. Because you read these minutes from winter quarters when he's meeting with them. And Thomas Bullock, in his goofy, sort of shorthand, sort of longhand minutes, is documenting this truly unbelievable meeting between him and church leaders. And like you said, within months, all of a sudden there is a hard pivot. And then, barring that episode, it'd be fascinating. That's one of your counter historical questions. How might it have been different had he not been there at that time? And critically, like you pointed out, this interracial relationships question, had that not been part of that, things might have been very different. And I think that's something that people today really can't totally appreciate, is how much interracial relationships drive this question. Because that is really, truly scary to church leaders in a way that today just seems completely foreign.
Well, it's true. And I was reading a manuscript by a well-known LDS author yesterday, in fact, critiquing a chapter for the scholar, and it was thrown out in the chapter, at least offered, that Joseph Smith had offered or proposed that Jane Manning James would be his plural wife, and as opposed to being sealed as a child. And I responded back that I don't believe this at all. Interracial marriage was scandalous, not just among Mormon leaders, but Americans in general in the 19th century. And the reason why it's scandalous is because a lot of Americans believe that there was such a thing as a pure race. And if you have the purity of a race mixing with the impurity of another race, it would taint the bloodlines, they argued. Obviously, this is so incredibly and profoundly racist, but this is what they believed. And they followed what's called the one-drop rule. It was an old slave derivative in the 1830s in which people, usually in the slaveholding South, they created this idea that if anybody has one drop of African blood in them, they would be denied interracial intimacy, love, and sex. In other words, it was supposed to keep these greedy and lustful slaveholding predators from having sex with their slaves. And so it's those guys that devised the rule, but of course they didn't adhere to it because they have lots of light-skinned and biracial people on slave plantations. So it's going on everywhere. They're just not enforcing it. And Brigham Young and others will slowly enforce the one-drop rule over the course of the 19th century. And just for your listeners to understand truly what the one-drop rule means, that if you have 100 African, or 100, let me get this right. You have 99... No.
If you have 100 ancestors,
you have 100 ancestors, and one of them was black. You
just one.
Just one. And it's in 1930, the U.S. Census picks up on the one-drop rule and identifies anyone who's a Negro in those days if they have one drop. Now, it's important to know this is not based on skin color. It's based on lineage. So you could have somebody from, let's say, Fiji, who's a very dark-skinned man, and the church didn't believe that Fijians had ancestry from Africa, and so they could hold the priesthood. But if you could have a white dude with blonde hair, blue eyes, and who allegedly has an African ancestor somewhere back in his family line, they would be denied. They'd be considered cursed.
In that
so it's a tough way.
I was just going to say, in that wonderful documentary, Nobody Knows, that Margaret Young and Darius Gray put together, Armin Moss tells that very story of a friend of his that, for all appearances, looked white, but discovered had an African ancestor and was therefore not allowed to have the priesthood. And so all of these are concrete examples that come up over time. And so as the 19th century progresses, folks like Elijah Abel and Jane Manning James are complicating this matter. But the church leaders deal with that, and obviously we're skipping over a lot of history that people can read about in your book. But then as we get into the 20th century, as the LDS Church really starts to expand and globalize, that problem really becomes complicated, particularly in places like South Africa, places like Brazil, where you had centuries of interracial marriages that really make it difficult. So how do church leaders deal with this question in places like that?
Boy, they struggled. And the church leaders had known early on, since 1852, that the ban would be tough to go into predominantly Black and biracial countries, but they tried. In 1852 and 53, just around the time the ban was being promoted publicly, they decided to send missionaries from Utah into Jamaica. And they weren't there very long, and they said, this isn't a very good place for our doctrine. So, and they also tried in South Africa. And so they did try, but for the most part, they left majority Black and biracial countries alone until the 20th century, when South Africa and Jamaica failed in the mid-19th century. And the two places that gave them the biggest issues would be Brazil and South Africa. So they abandoned the South African mission in 1852 and 3, and they reopened it again in the early 20th century. And in Brazil, another place that gave them fits, they opened it up in 1929, and they knew that the racial lines, as they put it, in Brazil and South Africa were badly blurred. So what they decided to do was to focus on areas of those countries where ethnic origins appeared to be certain. So, for example, in southern Brazil, there was a heavy concentration of Germans who had moved there. In northern Brazil, there were Afro or African or Black African Brazilians who lived there. And so the missionaries were told to stay out of northern Brazil and just focus on southern Brazil. But that became really, really difficult when people from the north began moving to places in the south in the 1930s. So the population had become more diverse over time, and the missionaries and the mission president in those areas absolutely didn't know what to do, because there's no such thing as a pure bloodline. So they really struggled. And they wrote letters to the brethren back in Salt Lake, the mission presidents would, and they would say, we don't know who has the curse. Give us guidance, direct us. And the brethren, basically, the only things they told them was that when they set them apart as mission presidents, they said, you're on your own, follow the Spirit. And of course, that's not helpful when you're dealing with a majority Black and biracial country like Brazil. So what they would do to determine who had this cursed ancestry, some of them would turn to patriarchal blessings, and they would ask the patriarchs to discern if this person had African blood. Now, this is quite comical, because they're putting the onus on these poor patriarchs to, figure this out. And of course, they're nervous as heck. They don't know. And if they pronounce the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which are priesthood and temple blessings, or they go further and pronounce Ephraim on their heads, those are again priesthood and temple blessings, that was proof positive that they had passed the racial litmus test. But if they were, of course, pronounced from the lineage of Cain or Ham or Canaan, these are three extra biblical, or these are three non-Israelite lineages, then they would be deemed cursed. They also did genealogy in South Africa. They had to trace their ancestral lines out of Africa in order to prove their racial purity. So the burden of proof was on the prospective convert to show that they couldn't get baptized or ordained to the priesthood or sealed in the temple unless they did their genealogy. Well, Who do you think's doing the genealogy? 19 and 20-year-old young men and women. Boy, I have a lot of confidence. And so the missionaries aren't trained in any of this stuff. It's a comedy of errors. And they acknowledge, as I point out in my book, I quoted from some missionaries, they're not trained, they feel inadequate. And they also felt the burdens of history bearing down upon them. One young man wrote, the great institute teacher at the University of Utah, Lowell Benyon. His name is Larry Storrs. He was a former student of Benyon's. And he said, "Dear Brother Benyon, I just arrived in Brazil. I have no idea who bears the curse. It's impossible. And besides, I think this is morally wrong for a person like me to make these judgments." And so they're feeling the pressure of this. And in Brazil, they were taught by their mission presidents to knock on the door. And if a person opened the door and they looked black, and whatever that means, they looked black, meaning that I guess they bore the curse, they were taught to say, "Can you tell me where the grocery store is?" Rather than proselytizing them, they would then pivot on a moment's notice when they recognized they were black. They would say, "Can you tell me where the grocery store is?" Or they would ask for something trivial and they'd be on their way. If they were not sure of their lineage, they would then ask to come in and they would do their best to determine if this man or woman, owner of the house, had ancestry from Africa. They would ask them simple questions. "Oh, where are you from?" And they're not telling them their intent. This is all done on the sly. And they would ask to see their photo albums. They were looking for proof that these people had relatives in Africa. I mean, completely dishonest. It's not the church's finest hour by any stretch. But this is the burden of policing racial boundaries in the 20th century when the world over, including the United States, are suffering from this same burden. And one of the things that people would do, particularly in South Africa, is that they would not be able to trace their ancestry out of this continent. And so they would get upset because they couldn't dance in the priesthood or marry in the temple. And they were the only place in the church that had this burden because, after all, it is the continent of Africa. And so the saints in South Africa, many of whom were light-skinned, they didn't like this unfair burden, and they recognized that nowhere else in the church had this. And they also were upset because if there were older Latter-day Saints, their children who didn't want to do the genealogy or couldn't prove their racial purity, they would simply pack up their bags and move to Utah and Idaho, where they would pass below the color line. They looked white, and nobody questioned. Ecclesiastical authorities did not question their lineage, and so they would get ordained to the priesthood and sealed in the temple. And they would write back to their parents in South Africa, "Dear Mom and Dad, I just got married in the temple last week. Here's a picture of my fiance." And the parents, of course, their spiritual growth in the church has been halted because of their inability to prove their racial purity. And when their children got married, they would then turn to the mission president and say, "Why could they enjoy the blessings of the church and not me?" And the mission president, at the time, a guy named Evan Wright, he wrote the Brethren in Salt Lake, all of these heartrending things, talking about how people could advance in South Africa, and so they would simply pack up and leave. And so he informed the Brethren that people of alleged cursed ancestry were flouting the church's racial boundaries by moving to Utah. And people in Utah knew this was happening too. I have lots of documents in my book where one document, this is from Edgar Lyon, who was a colleague of Lowell Banyon's at the University of Utah Institute. He wrote an interesting email. No, he didn't write an email in 1955. He wrote a letter. He wrote an interesting letter to a friend, and he said that we know where there are colored people passing below the color line everywhere. We know of at least 2 instances of a man in a bishopric, or men in bishoprics. So they know this is going on, but the Brethren don't know what to do about it.
It's very messy, and you do have cases like that where someone is ordained, and later on it turns out, they actually did have African ancestry, and then what? And church leaders hear about these things, and so that's and as you're pointing out here, these things aren't resolved. There's no good solution to that, and so that's just this strand of tension that continues all throughout. And then in larger context, obviously these things are not happening in some sort of Mormon vacuum, and there are things that Mormons are interacting with. And so throughout the 20th century, policies of segregation are also present in Utah. I think that's something that people may not be quite as familiar with. That's something that happens in the South, not in Utah. But it happens in Utah as well. And so how does that play into how Mormon leaders think about this world?
Yeah, it's a de facto segregation in Utah, meaning, or it's going on in Utah, but it's not sanctioned by law. And so it's sanctioned by custom. And the church itself, church-owned properties were segregated. So private property being segregated by a private religion. And the fear was, much as you see in the larger American society, that if you have integrated restaurants and integrated hotels and movie theaters and buses and you name it, the idea would be that Black and white people would work together, associate with each other, ultimately, and tragically from an LDS church standpoint, fall in love and maybe marry. So interracial marriage is driving this idea of segregation in the church and also in various establishments in Salt Lake City. And so there wasn't a huge Black population in the early 20th century in Salt Lake, but there was enough of a population in both Salt Lake and Ogden where city leaders took notice and they wanted to confine the African-American population to certain sectors of the city. They didn't want them associating with white people. And you can imagine this created a really huge brouhaha at the Hotel Utah. This is the finest hotel in Salt Lake. It's owned by the church. And whenever guests would come to Salt Lake, particularly the University of Utah as a guest lecturer or guest artist, they would want to stay in the nicest establishment. But the church wouldn't let them. And they make a few exceptions. One exception, there's this wonderful singer named Marian Anderson, and they tell her that she has to dine alone in the dining hall. She can't eat with white people. Another distinguished guest, they say that he has to ride the freight elevator to his room. And in one instance, there's a famous congressman from Harlem, and he wanted to stay at the Hotel Utah, and the clerk said, "I'm sorry, we can't host you." And he was angry and demanded to speak with the chairman of the board, which happened to be the church president. And so he demands to speak with David O. McKay, and he calls up McKay right there at the front desk. Now, I'm not sure how that happens. You know, the front desk worker has a direct line to the president, you know, who's also the chairman of the board. But they did. And I have an oral history that I have in my book, I quote, where the person is next in line, and he hears this distinguished Black congressman from Harlem yelling at the church president. And the church president's getting animated too. And he writes this all down, you know, this observation. And it ended with the young clerk allowing the congressman to stay at the hotel. So it worked. The pressure on President McKay worked. Also, too, when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down segregated schools in that historic case called Brown versus the Board, the Brethren were really, really nervous about that because they didn't know how that would affect segregated church properties. And a lot of Latter-day Saints from around the church, they wrote letters in to the First Presidency and to the Quorum of the 12. They wanted to know, how could we as a church support segregation? It is antithetical to Thomas Jefferson's creed that all men are created equal. What's interesting, reading these letters, they didn't really focus on 2 Nephi 26:33, that all men are all alike unto God. They didn't really make that connection. In fact, just as a side note, few Latter-day Saints talked about all are alike unto God before the ban was lifted. They just simply couldn't reconcile it with this ban. So, but they did appeal to the Declaration of Independence, and Joseph Fielding Smith was the person who received a lot of these angry letters. The Brethren would just pass them on to him. Here, Joseph, have that, buddy. And a lot of these letters that he received, not just on this topic, but from other theological and historical topics, he published in a multi-volume series that you guys sell in your bookstore called Answers to Gospel Questions. And so a lot of the questions I saw one of the files I saw in the Joseph Fielding Smith papers at the church archives were letters that the sage wrote President Smith asking how he could reconcile this idea of exclusion with the notion that all men are created equal. And he just couldn't. I mean, it's really, really hard to do that. If you really believe that all men are created equal, you really believe it. There are no exceptions. And so you really had to tiptoe around those letters.
So one of the most interesting responses to Brown versus Board of Education, I thought, was that 1954 meeting of church educators with Marky Peterson as sort of the headliner. And I don't know if there was anyone who was more triggered by that than Peterson. And I found that meeting so interesting. Talk a little bit about what happened at that meeting and the reactions that you see happening.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court, as they usually do, they announce their opinions in June. At least the bulk of them are announced in June. So the Brown decision came out in June. And the brethren, of course, were terrified. They didn't know where this would all lead. They thought that it was the first domino that would be knocked down. It would lead to other dominoes falling. And by other dominoes, I mean that if you declare that segregation in schools is unconstitutional, what's next? Employment, restaurants, housing, you name it. So they were worried about all of this. And David O. McKay's response as the church president was, the less we say about it, the better. People won't get on us if we support it or reject it. Let's just remain silent. J. Reuben Clark took a more moderate approach. Let's acknowledge civil rights, that it's not incompatible with the gospel, but he never said what he supported. Did he support legislation to protect against discrimination in employment or public accommodations, as they call it, housing? He didn't say. And he clearly didn't support, civil rights that deal with interracial marriage. So he just threw it out there. And then you've got a third voice, Mark Peterson, who gave one of the most vitriolic responses to a Supreme Court decision I've ever seen in the church. And in August of 1954, 2 months after the court's opinion, Mark E. Peterson, who had been in the Quorum of the 12 since 1944, decides that he wants to address the issue to a large gathering of church education employees and also BYU religion faculty. And this is at BYU, and this is part of a weeks-long series of classes that many of the apostles from Salt Lake had been giving to these teachers. And so this wasn't a standalone meeting. It was just part of that, those week-long series, or those, I guess it did it for like 8 weeks during the summer of 54. And they had different topics, on evolution, revelation, just important topics that they wanted to instruct the teachers on. Well, Peterson decided to make his topic on race. And it's to this day, it's probably the most aggressive sermon or speech in the 20th century among LDS leaders. And the reason why it's so tough is not because he appeals to the Bible to justify segregation. Southern clergymen have been doing that for a long time. Nothing unique there. It's not because he had supported outright segregation, both in the church and in communities, but he said some of the most aggressive things that only a handful of church leaders would have accepted. That not only were Black people inferior to white people, he claimed in this speech, he said that they were only fit to be servants to white people in the hereafter. I mean, this is extraordinary. One can't imagine, David O. McKay, Spencer Kimball, and some of the other more moderates saying such a thing. Well, they didn't say such a thing, so I don't have to imagine it. I mean, that's just, those are very radical beliefs. And the fact that he's saying it during the beginnings of a national civil rights movement for racial equality is absolutely stunning. I mean, Elder Peterson was completely tone deaf in which ways the wind was blowing in August of 1954. And so he's saying this sort of thing. And he also says, so he gives the speech, and there are a lot of people there, and in the church education system, for your listeners may not know this, there's a range of views in both politically and theologically. There are hardliners among the teachers, there are liberals among the teachers, and everything in between. And so Elder Peterson's address provokes a range of responses. And Elder Peterson and Joseph Fielding Smith, his companion that day, they were the two apostles there, they decided that they would have a Q&A afterwards with the address. And when I found the transcript of this Q&A, it's never been seen before by anybody. When I found it in an archive, I was absolutely stunned and shocked because it was so open. And this is a transcript from a private meeting that was not meant for public consumption. So there were no artificial sweeteners in their responses to the leaders. There was no sugarcoating anything. I mean, they gave everything to these educators raw and unvarnished. And so when they opened it up, the first question that was asked was by the great Mormon apologist Hugh Nibley, and he asked Joseph Fielding Smith, so this was Fielding Smith and Peterson right there together, fielding questions. They asked Joseph Fielding Smith, is it true that the dark skin of Negroes disappears when they are righteous? And Joseph Fielding Smith writes back, we know of actual cases where this has happened. And the idea in Mormon theology, not today, this is not a church teaching today, so I don't want anyone to think that it is, because it's not. But in those days, the idea was that the entire human race was white, and that brown and black people had done something to offend God, and then God put a curse upon them. The Book of Mormon, of course, deals with the curses of Native Americans or indigenous populations, but it doesn't say anything about black people. But anyway, so they did something to offend God. Black and brown people get this curse, and that over time, through righteous living and repentance of their sins, God would gradually lift the curse. And the brethren couldn't, making them white again. The brethren couldn't decide if the curse would be lifted in mortality or if it would be in the resurrection. But they talk about this a lot in their literature in the Improvement era and elsewhere in the 20th century, that these cursed individuals would become whitened. And obviously, this whole idea, this racial binary of black being representative of sin and savagery, and white being, purity and wholesomeness and righteousness, that racial binary is obviously problematic, especially for people on the margins. And so Joseph Fielding Smith acknowledges this to the educators, and I can imagine Hugh Nibley just sitting there thinking, I don't believe this. Because Nibley will write in private, after the revelation is given lifting the ban in 1978, Hugh Nibley will write in private that he never believed in any of this stuff, never believed in racial purity. But Nibley had never had the courage to go on record and to challenge the brethren. Because Nibley had known, being the voracious reader that he was, that race was socially constructed. We all have black African ancestry. Nibley didn't know that if we go back 200 years, like we know today, if we go back 200 years, that each of us has at least one African or indigenous ancestor. But Nibley was reading Franz Boas, the great German anthropologist at Columbia University, who's at the vanguard of scholarship on race construction. He's publishing all this stuff in the early 20th century. And Nibley and Hugh Lowell Benyon, another person who rejects the ban, they're reading Franz Boas. And unlike Benyon, who does share some of these readings with the brethren, Nibley keeps it to himself. Anyway, during the transcript, there are other revealing moments where they pin Peterson down. They ask Elder Peterson, do you believe that we ought to draw a line, a fence, between black and white communities in Salt Lake? And he stumbles over this question. He ignores it and he says, well, they ought to be segregated. But the question was not whether they ought to be segregated, because we know that you believe that. Do you think there ought to be this impenetrable wall in Salt Lake dividing black and white people? And he didn't want to answer it. And finally, at the very end, after, 2 hours of intense Q&A, one of the educators, sadly, their name is not recorded in the transcript, but they ask Peterson, do you believe that white people are inferior to black people? And Peterson gives him this answer that's barely coherent because he doesn't want to go on record to answer it. But when I read this, I thought this is kind of a crazy, strange question because it was clear from his sermon and from all of the answers he had been given to that point that he did believe that black people were inferior to white people. But when he was asked point blank to go on record, he sort of shied away. Let me say one last thing about this idea of racial construction that comes out of this Q&A. Lowell Benyon is listening to this discussion. He's watching, Hugh Nibley and Sidney Sperry and others, Paul Dunn, before he was a general authority. He was there. And so Lowell Benyon is listening to all of this, and he raises this question, and he makes two really powerful statements that would later get him in trouble with the Brethren. The one statement was, he said, Elder Peterson, how is it that we can publish a whole race of people, multi-generations of African Americans and black Africans and so on? How can we punish them for the collective sins of their ancestors? Wouldn't a loving and just and merciful God give them the ability to repent if they did something wrong? In other words, this venerated church education employee is calling Elder Peterson's theology bad. He's questioning if this is Christian, if this is in accordance with the scriptures. And of course, Elder Peterson doesn't enjoy being chastised by a man without priesthood authority, at least equivalent to his. The other question that comes up that I found really fascinating was Benyon also asked the Brethren a pointed question. He said that he had a student at the University of Utah that had blonde hair, blue eyes, but that one of his ancestors had a cursed lineage. And so this young man was cursed. And Benyon said that his sister was poised to marry in the temple, but when the curse was revealed, she couldn't marry in the temple. This young man wanted to serve a mission, but he couldn't serve a mission. And he wanted to marry somebody. And Benyon didn't know what to tell him because the young man said, should I marry a black woman, but I don't identify as black? I'm white. But I can't marry a white person if I'm cursed because it would curse our children and they would be prohibited from full church participation. So Benyon's explaining this conundrum, and he asked Joseph Fielding Smith for advice. President Smith, what advice would you have me give this young man? Who should he marry? And Smith thought for a moment, and he said, I have no advice to give this young man. And then they moved on to the next question. And these are the kind of poignant moments where church leaders are coming up close and personal with the consequences of the priesthood ban and the theologies underlying it. And I don't think for a moment that Joseph Fielding had ever considered the impact that these racial boundaries the one drop rule would have on a white Latter-day Saint like this. But I'm certain that after the meeting ended that day, he probably gave it some thought.
Interesting to see what happened to this slowly growing movement to push back against that. And unfortunately for some, it didn't end well. In the cases of Lowell Benyon, you had reliant folks like that. What was the church response to them pushing back on the ban?
Yeah, I think one of the things in my research, Brian, that I learned that I was really, it was eye-opening, was I knew that there were always a couple of sort of renegade, CES teachers who didn't agree with the ban. I knew that they were there, but I thought they were on the margins. What I learned was there was an extraordinary number of faculty, both in the BYU religion department and in the BYU history department, and also in the church education system at large, who didn't agree with the ban. And they wrote all kinds of letters to each other talking about their displeasure. It's harming the church. It's preventing us from globalizing. This would have been in the 1950s. And most of these guys, because they valued their employment, decided to keep their views among themselves. They would just circulate their ideas in private to safe and trusted colleagues. But there were a couple of people that really, really put pressure on the Brethren. And these two men came at it from two different strategies. One was Sterling McMurrin, who was a philosophy professor at the University of Utah. He was a one-time seminary teacher in the 1930s before he became a philosophy professor. And he was a lapsed Mormon. He valued his Mormon culture and heritage, but wasn't really an active practicing Latter-day Saint. And the other one was his good friend, Lowell Benyon, who was very much a practicing Latter-day Saint, taught for nearly 3 decades at the University of Utah. And let me just speak to Sterling McMurrin first. McMurrin, because of his employment wasn't tied into the church, and because he wasn't active, he felt that he had this independence that he could criticize the brethren that other people in the system couldn't. And Sterling McMurrin founded a group in the early 50s called the Swearing Elders, in which he brought, the title itself is irreverent, right? The Swearing Elders. What's not to like? There ought to be a bumper sticker, the Swearing Elders. But he organized this group at the University of Utah, and it started out with just some of his colleagues in and around Salt Lake, but it really spread to faculty at Weber State. It spread to some BYU faculty. I'm convinced that the BYU faculty who showed up probably, came in disguise. They didn't want to be seen going into the meeting with the Swearing Elders. And also some outsiders would visit, like the great writer Bernard DeVoto. And occasionally a couple of the apostles showed up when they would want to defend the church's teachings or inform the Swearing Elders about contemporary issues like race, things that they were talking about and having issues with. So McMurrin did a couple of things that put the brethren on the defensive. The first was in 1960, he spoke at the NAACP in Salt Lake, the local chapter there, which is only a few blocks from church headquarters. And because he was brilliant, because he came from good Mormon stock, his grandfather, Joseph McMurrin, was in the presiding bishopric, because he had a photographic memory, they thought that McMurrin had a great capacity to harm the church. They were worried what he would say about the church's race teachings to the NAACP. So they sent, the First Presidency sent their secretary to spy on him. They wanted to monitor the free-thinking professor and what he had to say. And because he had a photographic memory, McMurrin got up there and he spoke extemporaneously for nearly 2 hours. Didn't have any notes. And there were 2 representatives from the church there. One was the First Presidency's secretary. The other one was sent by Joseph Fielding Smith, who was the church historian. He sent one of his assistants from the church historian's office. So both of these men were there to monitor the free-thinking McMurrin, and they were taking copious notes about his sermon, about his speech. And after it was over, they approached Dr. McMurrin and they said, "Hey, can we have your talk just to make sure that we got everything right?" And he said, "I don't have a talk." "Well, can you go over our notes for us and make sure that we got your talk right? Because we're going to submit it to the brethren."
Please do our work for us.
Yeah, right. Exactly. This is really a charming little incident because it speaks to McMurrin's personality. He's like, "Okay, you're going to take it back to use against me as fodder? I'll draw some smiley faces on there and say, 'Hi, President,' "Hi, Elder." But so he assists them. And it's really not good. It makes national news. The NAACP, they love the speech. He's criticizing it. And what he does is that he says something in this speech that will alarm the brethren. He tells the NAACP that not everybody in the church leadership agrees with the sanctity of the ban. And he hints that it's not a bishop, it's not a stake president, it's somebody at the very top of the food chain. And he does not reveal that it's President McKay, the church president, who by that point had been the prophet since 8 years. So it was ordained in 1952. But he hints that somebody at the top doesn't support this, and he won't reveal who that is until 1968, some 8 years later. But there is a sense that there are some problems with the ban at the top of the leadership. The other person is Lowell Benyon, who writes the church president. Actually, he writes his friend, Apostle David O. McKay. So this is before McKay became the church president. He wrote Elder McKay a letter in 1943 in which it's a long letter, it's a wonderful letter, in which he bears his soul. I can't agree with this Negro doctrine, he calls it. It's unjust, it's unmerciful, it doesn't square with the scriptures, and it's bad for the church. Lowell Benyon, I want to just say something about Benyon so your readers, your listeners may understand him. He's lost to this generation, but anybody of an older generation would know Lowell Benyon in and around Salt Lake. He was a legend. And Lowell Benyon was a firm believer that theology had to make you better. If it didn't make you a better person, the theology was no good. In other words, let's not talk about dogma, something that may prepare us for the next life, that some angry God's going to punish you unless you do X, Y, and Z. That was a fear tactic that Benyon rejected. The beauty of the gospel, he argued, was in the here and now. It would make us be more principled, more ethical, more loving, more forgiving, more merciful. And if it didn't do any of those things, it was bad theology. And that's what he's arguing to Elder McKay in 1943. And McKay himself had not come to the conclusion yet that the ban was more rooted in practice than doctrine. He was still working through these ideas himself, although he had felt profoundly uncomfortable with the ban over the years. And McKay wrote back, and it was a loving letter. And he said to Benyon, he said, it's okay that you're sharing these things with me. He wanted to let Benyon know that I'm going to give you the space to speak your mind and your heart and your soul. And Benyon's response is, or McKay's response is that black people who are banned from the priesthood, he appeals to the pre-existent life. He doesn't go into details, but that's his only rationale. He does not believe that black people are cursed. He doesn't believe in the Genesis account or the Moses account in the book of Abraham, where skins of blackness could be equated with black people. That's how they interpret it. He doesn't believe in any of that. So he gives Benyon the space to do this, and he's good friends with Benyon. He would oftentimes, as would Hugh B. Brown, McKay's later first counselor in the first presidency, both Brown and McKay would often ask Benyon for his opinion on sensitive church matters. So he wasn't any ordinary person. And Benyon had taken that license from the church president and had been given firesides in the church talking about how the ban is unscriptural and unsound. Now, just pause for a moment. I can't imagine today that there would be any teacher in the church education system who could give firesides to believing, practicing Orthodox Latter-day Saints, criticizing a major doctrine of the church. But Benyon felt like he could because he had David O. McKay's support. And what did Lowell Benyon in, what got him fired ultimately, was he started teaching that to his students at the University of Utah. The church was, in 1961, 62, they were poised to move into Nigeria, the sub-Saharan African country. They decided that they would have white missionaries from Utah go to Nigeria to run all black churches. Doesn't take a genius to realize how problematic this is going to be, right? It sends a loud and clarion call that black people aren't good enough to run their own churches. It has to be white people from Utah who hold the priesthood. And so this is an experiment, and Hugh Brown, McKay's counselor, had been pushing for priesthood ordination in Nigeria, albeit the Aaronic priesthood at the time. He thought that if you give them the Aaronic priesthood, it would open the way for the Melchizedek priesthood. So this is Brown's clever little tactic to lift the ban. And so Brown tells Benyon that the ban will be lifted in April of 1962, and that Nigerians will be able to hold the Aaronic priesthood. And Benyon runs with it. He tells his students this. Word gets out down the hill. So this is at the Institute, the top of the hill in Salt Lake, for your listeners who may not be acquainted with Salt Lake. And down the hill, of course, would be the church headquarters. So word travels to church headquarters down the hill that one of their trusted leaders is predicting that the ban is going to end. And in response, Joseph Fielding Smith, who gets word of this, he hires a man, or appoints a man in the church education system, a young CES teacher named Melvin Tagg. He appoints him to the Institute faculty with the sole purpose to spy on Lowell Benyon, his colleague Ed Lyon, and a third guy named Albert Payne, all three of whom had been teaching that the ban would end. all three of whom had been teaching that the band was racist. So Mel Tagg is sent there to spy on his colleagues. And when Benyon learned that Tagg was being appointed unilaterally without any input from the faculty, he was really upset. And both he and Lyon immediately suspected that something sinister was afoot, and they were not wrong. And so Tagg decides that he asks Benyon directly and Lyon, what are your views on blacks in the priesthood? So he's setting them up. And so they answer, we think it's immoral, we think it's unjust, and we think the ban needs to end. And so Tagg gets the ammunition he needs, goes back down the hill to report to Joseph Fielding Smith. He says, this is what they're teaching. Joseph Fielding responds by appointing his assistant, a guy named Lawrence Peterson. So he's the assistant church historian, Lawrence Peterson. Lawrence Peterson goes to the institute and starts to interview faculty and students. Have these men been teaching this? And the answer was a resounding yes. And finally, Boyd Packer and Theodore Tuttle, both of whom had once worked in the church education system with Edgar Lyon and Lowell Benyon, they were also sent to investigate. So now they're lower level general authorities they were once friends with Benyon and Lyon. Now they're general authorities sent in to investigate after Lawrence Peterson's investigation. And so Lowell Benyon, who was never one to hold back, he tells Boyd Packer, his former friend, and also Theodore Tuttle, that yes, it's true. I've been saying this. Yes, it's true. It's incompatible with the gospel. And Packer and Tuttle then turn and report. And almost within days, they fire Benyon and Lyon from their teaching positions. And the person who has to deliver the bad news is the chancellor in the church education system. He wears two hats as both the president of BYU and the chancellor. This is Ernest Wilkinson. So Ernest Wilkinson informs these two men that they're fired. And to save face, they offer Lyon a reassignment writing church manuals. And if anybody were to ask, we can couch it as a promotion. Now, this is not a promotion. It's a ruse to remove them from the classroom. But that's how they couch it. And Benyon, they didn't want to give Benyon, they wanted Benyon out of the system altogether. They wanted him gone. I guess they thought Benyon was the louder voice than Lyon. But to save face, Ernest Wilkinson, of all people, we tend to think of him as this brash and really overbearing personality, and he was. But this is one of those moments where he had this tender moment where he goes to the brethren and the board and he says, hey, look, we got to at least allow Benyon to write manuals too. Can we make him that offer? And the brethren discuss it and they grumble among themselves and they decide that it would be a complete public relations disaster if they didn't allow Benyon this opportunity as well. And I should add, too, that, Brian, most people don't know Benyon today, but this guy is a landmark in America. I can't emphasize this enough. The Laura Thatchell Ulrich, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Mormon historian at Harvard University, she's now retired, but she talks about when she was at the U in the early 1950s or mid-50s, she talks about Lowell Benyon was a landmark in her life, that he really set her on a course of scripture study and also just simply good Christian ethics that she would prize for the rest of her life. So anyway, he's this towering intellectual influence in the lives of just so many young Latter-day Saint people, and they fire them. Benyon does not want the assignment of writing. He thinks it's humiliating. He declines it and decides to take a position at the University of Utah. But it really sends this shot across the bow in 1962 that if the church can fire these two hugely significant Latter-day Saint educators, nobody was safe.
Fascinating to see how that pushback ultimately ended for them. So as that's happening, this is the early 60s, we also have the civil rights movement that's picking up speed. And we'll see, let's say, two differing responses to that within church hierarchy. On the one hand, you've got Ezra Taft Benson. On the other hand, you've got Hugh B. Brown. Talk about how they're two models of responding to the civil rights movement?
Yeah, so Ezra Taft Benson was called into the Quorum of the 12 in 1943. He was a relatively moderate kind of guy. Might be hard for some of your listeners to comprehend, given what we know about him. But in the 1940s, he was sort of a moderate guy. He voted for Thomas E. Dewey for the president in 1948, the governor of New York. Dewey was a moderate. And because Benson, who was involved in farm cooperatives in Washington, D.C. at the time, because he was rising in farm circles, and because he did have some moderate views, Thomas Dewey decided to make him, or told Benson that he would appoint him as his agricultural secretary if he won the election. Well, it turns out Truman won. But anyway, he was a moderate for a short period, and he was always anti-New Deal, this liberal president, but his opposition to the New Deal wasn't as virulent as one would imagine in the 1930s. Benson's opposition became more pronounced towards the New Deal much later. But by the time Eisenhower was appointed the president in 1953, he appointed Benson into his cabinet as a secretary, and his entire 8 years in Ike's cabinet changed him. And he wasn't used to getting pushback. I mean, this is an apostle who does not get pushback from the saints. I mean, Latter-day Saints, as you know, are taught to revere their leaders, to not question them. Even if the counsel is wrong, you're still supposed to heed it and God will bless you. And so in his 8 years in the cabinet, Elder Benson was absolutely taken aback when people would criticize his farm policies. Lobbyists, bureaucrats, colleagues. He just wasn't used to it. He had a hard time with it. And in the meantime, he's writing First Presidency Counselor J. Reuben Clark, who's an ultra-conservative, and he's expressing reservations about the government. He starts to believe that there's a conspiracy afoot by Jews in the government. And Reuben Clark was a profound anti-Semite, and he and Elder Benson are sharing these anti-Semitic views. And they would write, stuff like, don't share this with President McKay, because they know that President McKay wouldn't approve of this. But the idea is that there's this anti-Semitic cabal within the government to take it over. And it's the Jews who had influenced government leaders with their socialist and communist ideas. So by the 50s, Benson's starting to peddle these extreme views along with Reuben Clark. And they would later influence Cleon Skousen, Benson's close friend and neighbor. And when Benson finished his government service in 1961, he becomes involved with the John Birch Society, the most extreme anti-communist organization in the country. And there wasn't a conspiracy theory the Birchers didn't like. The government was fluoridating the water, and that was a sinister communist plot to subvert public health. I mean, that's just nutty stuff to think that the government's going to put stuff in the water to subvert public health. Why would the government do that? Kill its own people. But that's really where this is headed. Government people were on the communist payroll. I mean, all kinds of leaders were on the communist payroll, and Benson would buy into the Birch idea that even Ike himself was a communist or had communist ties. I mean, just nutty stuff. 5-star general, nutty stuff. He's basically calling his former boss a traitor. The United Nations is communist. And of course, the civil rights movement is fomented by communists, including Martin Luther King. And so Benson's been radicalized by this stuff. And by the early 50s, Brian, he starts to listen to right-wing talk radio, which is emerging in the United States in the 1950s. And he's listening to Billy Hargis, Dan Smoot, and a guy named Clarence Mannion. Those are the three biggest right-wing talk radio hosts during the Cold War era. They would be equivalent to Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, people like that today. Thousands of people are listening to this Cold War right-wing radio, including Benson. And what they teach him is that the conspiracy is much more involved and further along than he ever could imagine. So he takes that right-wing stuff. I should tell you that Mannion, Hargis, and Smoot are all Birchers too. He takes this right-wing stuff and he looks at the civil rights movement through that prism. And he makes it his mission, his apostolic mission, to warn the saints that civil rights is no good, The NAACP, a civil rights organization, is no good. They all are aligned with the Kremlin. And so he starts to promulgate these views, both at BYU devotionals, where he has the captive audience of hundreds and thousands, or hundreds, probably thousands of Latter-day Saint young men and women. He says it in General Conference. And in the meantime, his counterpart in the church hierarchy, a guy named Hugh Brown, who was called to be an assistant to the Quorum of the 12 in 1953, elevated to the Quorum itself in 1958, and then elevated yet again in 1960 to the first presidency. So he has this rapid rise in church leadership. He's a gifted speaker. The saints love him, but he's a liberal. He is a liberal Canadian in a church hierarchy dominated by conservative Republicans from Idaho and Utah. And when Brown came to the United States in the 1920s, he asked the great Mormon theologian B.H. Roberts, he said, "What political party should I join?" And Roberts said, "You should be a Democrat like me." And Brown said, "That's good enough." And so Brown was involved in Democratic Party politics in Utah in the 1930s and 40s. He wasn't just a voting Democrat. He was absolutely entrenched into the party apparatus. And so he becomes this Democrat, and he pushes back on the right-wing extremism of Benson. And let me give just one example that is instructive. In the fall of 1963, the NAACP, both the Salt Lake and Ogden chapters, are poised to protest General Conference. This is the fall of 1963. There's a Civil Rights Act at the national level that's being debated and discussed. Turns out it won't be passed until the following year in 64, but it's being debated and discussed. There's also a housing employment and jobs employment bill in the state legislature in Utah. And the church had decided that they would remain silent on both the state civil rights bills and the national bill. And the NAACP, most of whom are African Americans from Utah, they're tired of the discrimination. They can't get a house or rent an apartment because they're Black. They're turned away from jobs because they're Black. And so they decide to take matters into their own hands and protest the conference. Well, when Hugh Brown learns from his good friend Sterling McMurrin, with whom we discussed, who's a member of the NAACP, McMurrin tells him they're going to march, they're going to protest. And Brown's furious. And so he goes to the president. He says, "President McKay, can we meet with them and compromise? We don't want the bad publicity." And McKay is somewhat of a segregationist himself. He doesn't want integration, but he's not as radical as Benson and others. He tells Brown, "You can read a statement at the conference, but I want you to integrate it into your sermon so as to not give the impression that is the sanctioned by the church or the first presidency." In other words, McKay is worried about how a pro-civil rights statement will affect the segregationist apostles like Mark Peterson and Ezra Benson. So Brown, being the crafty guy that he is, the statement was written by McMurrin with a few light editorial changes by Brown. And he stands up and he welcomes he's presiding, I should say, at the conference. And he stands up and he welcomes the saints. And he said, "I would like to read a statement before I begin today." He's completely ignoring the wishes of the president to integrate it into his talk. So I want to read a statement today. He reads the statement, and then he says, "Now I'll begin my talk." And so, of course, everybody within earshot, including members of the Quorum of the 12, they think this is the official statement of the church. Spencer Kimball writes in his diary something like, "President Brown gave this pro-civil rights statement today in church. I didn't see that coming. It's the official statement of the church. Who knew?" And anyway, so he gives this pro-civil rights statement. It's very generic. It doesn't say anything about the bills being passed at the national state levels, but it's just basically saying that civil rights is not incompatible with Mormon theology. It's very tepid.
Yeah.
And so almost within days of President Brown reading that statement, Ezra Taft Benson releases a statement in which he talks about the civil rights movement being fomented by communists. I mean, it's not good. It directly undermines everything Brown is trying to achieve. And when a San Francisco Chronicle reporter reaches out to Brown and says, "How do you reconcile Benson's statement with yours?" Brown snapped at him. He said, "Mine is the official position of the church. Benson speaks only for himself." And so these two men were jockeying for influence for much of the 1960s over civil rights.
Fascinating to see, colleagues that they don't openly engage each other very often. It's more kind of passive moving, tactical moving. But that's going on. Obviously, the athletic protests at BYU start to happen. But then we fast forward to December 1973, and for Mormons, kind of the unthinkable happens. This comparatively young church president, Harold B. Lee, suddenly passes away, and against everyone's expectations, a health-challenged Spencer Kimball is suddenly church president. And there had been things that had happened during McKay's presidency that had started to set some wheels in motion. But I think we have to be careful, too, that McKay, I think, has been painted as maybe too much of a progressive over the last, so many years. And that's one thing your book is very careful at doing, is saying, listen, people are complex. And just like Joseph Smith, painting him as too much of a progressive is not a good idea. Painting McKay as too much of a progressive, also not a good idea, because like you pointed out, he did share some of Benson's views. Not all of them, but some of them. But he did do things. A fascinating example that you point out is he was that close to actually ordaining a black man with the priesthood. But of course, these are just sort of initial movements to things. And then here comes Kimball. And I think among so many things that your book does, one of the strengths is it outlines the strategic nature of Kimball. Something that I think people don't understand is that's one of the sort of side benefits, is you point out that revelation in Mormon terms is a process, not an event. And so talk about what does Kimball do that will allow 1978 to happen?
So Kimball was wrestling with the band for a long time. And as a historian, I'm always curious to know, when did this start and who influenced him and when did he begin to have these hard feelings about it? And I was shocked one day when I was in Utah during one of my research trips. I went to visit Reed Moon's Rare Books, I think, in Orem area. And I'd heard that it was a great store, that he had great things in there. And I remember him being so kind and gracious, sharing with me early manuscripts that he had acquired. And anyway, when he learned what I was working on, he said, "Matt, stay here. I got to show you something." And I'm thinking to myself, I've already seen a lot of cool things. What's next? The Sword of Laban, the gold plates? What's going on here? He brings out the standard works from Spencer Kimball, the 1954 edition. And of course, as a historian, I'm just thrilled because he marks in his scriptures, not just, passages that he read as Mormons were wont to do, but he has this intertextual dialogue that sometimes critical readers have, including myself. I'll circle things and write question marks or no, not true, or good point, or, So, we have these readers have these dialogues with the text. Kimball does too. And he circled skins of blackness in the Book of Mormon, and he puts a question mark. He puts Negroes, question mark. In other words, he's questioning that this refers to black people. And there's a whole bunch of scribbles throughout his scriptures that deal with race. And I was just absolutely floored reading this. And so what that taught me was that Kimball started to wrestle with race as early as at least 1954. And he'd only been in the apostleship for 9 years at that point. And so, but internally, he's having this struggle. By 1963, he tells his son that the band, quote, may have been a possible error, end quote. This is a private letter. And in the 1960s, he's the apostle who's in charge of South America. And when I got access to his diaries, the unredacted diaries, I might add, not the stuff on the church website that's been redacted, I saw the unredacted, thanks to the late, great Ed Kimball, President Kimball's son. But when I read about Elder Kimball visiting various Latter-day Saints in Brazil and Ecuador and other places, I learned right away how the ban affected him so powerfully, because these black teenagers in particular would come up to him and they'd say, Elder Kimball, we want to hold the priesthood like our fellow teachers and priests do. They're going on missions. We long to go with them. One man comes up to him and he says, Elder Kimball, I've been paying my tithing for, 10 plus years now. When I first joined, I long to be still to the temple to my family. And Kimball has this profound moment where he goes back into his hotel later that night and he writes in his diary how much this moves him emotionally. So this isn't abstract theology to Kimball. This is affecting the lived religion of real people. And he's moved by this. And by 1969, as you mentioned, Hugh B. Brown, which I go into great, great detail in my book, Hugh B. Brown leads this crusade to get President McKay to lift the ban and ordain a black man by the name of Monroe Fleming to the priesthood. Spencer Kimball agrees to it. And so by 1973, when President Kimball is ordained the next church president after Harold Lee's untimely death, he'll make it the defining moment in his presidency to lift the ban. And I've been asked by so many people, if that's true, why didn't he just do it in 1973? And the answer is, Kimball was a student of Mormon history. He knew what happened when President Wilford Woodruff unilaterally lifted the ban in 1890. It produced a schism in the church, not only in the quorum itself, or half left, but also a number of Latter-day Saints left the church and formed their own fundamentalist groups because they wanted to practice polygamy.
Including his relatives.
Well said, Brian. I know that you and Lindsay have done some remarkable work with fundamentalist polygamy. So he knows all that, and he also lived during the 1960s when there were various schisms in church leadership because of the frail health of David O. McKay. On the one hand, you have the First Presidency counselors, two very capable men, N. Eldon Tanner and Hugh Brown, wanting to make important decisions in the absence of the president's voice. And on the other hand, you had Joseph Fielding Smith and Harold Lee and others in the quorum wanting to move into that leadership vacuum. So Kimball knew that he couldn't just wave his magic wand and do this, that it would take a revelation, which in Mormon parlance means that all of the leaders would have to agree to it. That's what the revelation in the Doctrine and Covenants says. So his task is to get the upper church leadership, the Quorum of the 12 and the two counselors in the First Presidency, 14 men. So he would be the 15th. He would have to get 14 men on board with this. And the fact that they come from different walks of life, the fact that they have different racial proclivities that are sort of run the gamut, this is a tough order. And one of the first people that he targets is probably he's the biggest holdup in Mormon theology when it comes to race. It's Bruce McConkie, who had written this incredibly racist book that was published in 1958 that had some harsh things to say about black people. And this is Mormon doctrine. It was, there was another printing done in 1966, and Elder McConkie was called into the 12 itself in the early 1970s, and everybody paid homage to Elder McConkie, who was the son-in-law of Joseph Fielding Smith. So between Smith and McConkie, they were the doctrinal experts in the church. People looked to them for guidance about what the doctrine of the church was or should be. And President Kimball knew instinctively that if he were to lift the ban, that Elder McConkie would stand in the way unless he won him over. So, without going into all the details in our limited time, because my book does this, but by March of 1977, President Kimball convinces Elder McConkie that the ban has to go. And he uses as leverage the newly announced Brazil temple. and he proposes to Elder McConkie, we've got this new temple in Brazil. As you know, the blood is, as President Kimball called it, the blood is so badly mixed. What should we do? Now, President Kimball knows what needs to be done, but he's posing the problem to Elder McConkie so that Elder McConkie could have buy-in to the solution. It is a brilliant strategy on Spencer Kimball's part to do this. And so Elder McConkie recognizes that the gospel cannot be preached to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people unless the church can move into biracial Brazil. And so McConkie creates this new theology to match the evolving times. He writes this lengthy memo to the church president, and he talks about the second coming, that Jesus can't come again unless we bring the gospel into these majority black countries. And more instructively, he creates new theology that says that black people could be adopted into the house of Israel and to become the full heirs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which are the covenant lineage blessings through which the temple and priesthood flow. And what's remarkable about this memo in March of 1977 that he writes is that just a few years earlier, when Spencer Kimball was the president of the Quorum of the 12, he had written Harold B. Lee and his counselors the same sort of question. Is it the doctrine of the church that black people could be adopted into the house of Israel? And the first presidency wrote back and they said, no, it's not the doctrine of the church. So here you have a new president, a new day, a new dawn, changing the doctrine to fit the evolving times. And Elder McConkie is front and center. And over the course of, from March of 77 forward, President Kimball will meet with the apostles one by one to win them over. Some of the ones he wins over early on, including his counselors, Nathan Tanner and Marion Romney. Others, it will take time. And there are three apostles, Brian, he cannot win over. One is Mark Peterson. And so President Kimball does something very strategic. He sends Elder Peterson on a church assignment to Ecuador, knowing full well that when they lift the ban, Elder Peterson would not be there to thwart the revelation. He also does it when Elder Delbert Stapley is in the hospital. He was another holdup. There is no evidence that I found that Elder Stapley was poised to ordain black men to the priesthood. And then finally, the other holdup was Ezra Taft Benson, who was the only person who showed up on June 1, 1978, who was not in agreement to lift the ban. And President Kimball had tried as early as March of 78, a full year after Elder McConkie came on board. He tried to lift the ban in March. He tried again in May. And finally, by June 1, he said, we're doing it. This is the day we're going to do it. He had already written out the revelation in longhand the week before. So, you know, for Latter-day Saints who learned that this was some kind of spontaneous moment where the angels appeared and God spoke, and I mean, it's just, it's just nonsense. And so this is a process by the church president who had been praying and fasting, spending time in the temple. He felt like this is what God wanted him to do. He felt that this was the best way to move the church forward and to globalize it. Well, on the day of June 1st, when they had their typical Thursday meeting in the temple, President Kimball asked the brethren to stay for an additional discussion. And he brought up the priesthood ban again. And Elder Benson proposed that they table the discussion. That is a nice way of saying, I don't want to talk about this. And President Kimball turned to Elder Benson and said, we're doing this. And what's interesting about that moment is that Elder McConkie came to President Kimball's aid and spoke to the 12 for at least 10 minutes, giving them the rationales for the ban. There's no scriptural justification, he tells them. We've got to lift the ban so we can globalize the church. And he also said that black people can be adopted into the house of Israel as covenant heirs with Christ. And it's Elder McConkie who wins over Benson and convinces him that this is the thing to do. This is what God wants. So they say a prayer, it lasts about 10 minutes, and they decide that there's this great spirit of unity among them. And then a week later, they announce it to the rest of the general authorities, And then on June 9th, they released their statement to the world.
So it's part process, but then also this specific event. And the specific event of the meeting of First Presidency and the 12 in the temple will then become a very interesting study because church leaders will start to talk about it publicly. And certain of them will talk about it in very different terms than their colleagues, which becomes a problem. What happens there?
Oh boy, it's a loaded question, Brian. Well, so President Kimball did something after the revelation. He told the brethren, not just the 12, but also the lower-ranking general authorities from the First Quorum of 70, the presiding bishopric, the church patriarch. He told them, he said, if anybody asks, point them to official declaration number 2. This was the official statement that Elder McConkie had written that would be released, and it's now canonized in, of course, the Pearl of Great Price. And he said, if anyone asks, have them read that, and also reaffirm that the revelation occurred by the voice of the Holy Ghost. The Spirit told us this is what God wanted us to do. And that was Kimball's very subtle way of saying we don't want anything embellished. That Jesus appeared, that past prophets had showed up and told us to lift the ban. Angels were there. But yet, apparently, Elder McConkie and Elder Packer never got the memo. I'm being facetious. I shouldn't be facetious. But Elder McConkie and Elder Packer ignore that advice, and they start to give firesides, and they speak in church meetings in which they embellish what happened on June 1st. Elder McConkie tells his family that it was just like at Kirtland. And his sister, a woman named Margaret Pope, she went by May's there taking notes when she's hearing from her brother that the events of lifting the ban was just like Kirtland. For any believing, practicing Latter-day Saint, that is not neutral language. What happened at the Kirtland Temple dedication in 1836, there were angels dancing on the roof. There were multiple visitations from the other world. I mean, when you use language just like at Kirtland, which is what Elder McConkie told his family, I mean, one's imagination now runs wild. And May asks him, which angels were there? Was Elias there? Was Gabriel there? Was Moroni there?
Just like Kirtland.
Just like Kirtland. Very well done. And so Elder McConkie, her brother, it says, just like Kirtland. And she would ask another question. Was Jesus there? Just like at Kirtland. And that's his response. And, you know, it's not a good response, because what happens is that May starts to circulate it herself. Her husband, Bill Pope, who's the stake president, one of the BYU awards, gets permission from his brother-in-law, Bruce, to spread the message about angelic beings being there. In the meantime, Boyd Packer, Elder McConkie's close friend, is also giving accounts of angelic beings. And Packer says it more directly than McConkie. He says, Jesus appeared to us and told us to lift the Negro doctrine. And so all of this gets back to President Kimball and also to the rest of the 12, and they're not happy about it. David Haight, LeGrand Richards, they both approach President Kimball, and they say, why is he saying we heard voices? We didn't hear any voices. We didn't see any beings. We just felt that we needed to make this change by the power of the Holy Ghost. And Gordon Hinckley gave a priesthood conference session in 1988. So this would have been 3 years after Elder McConkie died. And he said something that probably went over the heads of most Latter-day Saints. He said that no audible voice was heard. And he's responding to Elder McConkie, who said that they heard a voice. And so Gordon Hinckley was refuting that narrative. And so I heard about this narrative in Maine growing up as a teenager in the 1980s. I mean, I'm 3,000 miles away from all of this, and I heard about it. I heard it about it on my LDS church mission in the late 80s, early 90s to Idaho. So this is really something powerful in Mormon lore, and President Kimball didn't like it, and he rebuked Elder McConkie for teaching these things.
And it's understandable how it happens, because I think this is arguably a high watermark of 20th century Mormonism. This is a landmark, news story worldwide. So you can see how it happens. And that's what one of those very fun behind the scenes stories, because you go back and you're in the McConkie family meeting where you can see it start to happen. And then it spreads. And then you see how Kimball tries to counteract. That's fascinating.
Also, Brian, what's interesting is that some of the saints, as you can imagine, when they're hearing this from May Pope and others, there were people in May Pope's home ward in Provo, also Ed Kimball's home ward. They start to spread it. And when the word gets out, McConkie starts to rebuke them. And McConkie rebuked not just his sister for spreading false doctrine, which is strange because he's the one that promoted it. Excuse me, but he also rebuked one of May Pope's fellow ward members, who was shocked that he would do this because she had gotten the story from May Pope herself. And May Pope even added in some of the details that when this woman took notes. So when Elder McConkie wrote her a letter saying, don't spread this, the woman was absolutely devastated, thinking that she was spreading false doctrine. What Elder McConkie didn't tell her was the church president had rebuked me and that we're no longer to do this. And he did write her a note. He was gentle with this ward sister. He did write her a note, and he wasn't typical Elder McConkie in public, waving his finger and speaking in his stentorian tones. He just basically said he was sympathetic with her, and he blamed it on his sister May for giving you details that were incorrect.
Fascinating example.
Yeah.
Well, with McConkie in mind, it's important to note that when the ban is lifted, racism isn't also lifted. And part of that is because we still have books in print. So talk for a minute, what were the key books that had been published by church leaders that outlined this theology, and what happened to them?
Yeah, great question, Brian. So in 1978, when, of course, the ban was released to the world, they decided to announce it through official declaration number 2, which is now canonized in the scriptures. They canonized it at the October 1978 conference. And in the early years, the brethren just didn't want to talk about it. And it's amazing. If you look at the General Conference sermons from 1978, you would think that there would have been at least one sermon devoted specifically to that topic. Not so. Elder McConkie briefly mentions it, but nobody wanted to talk about it. And President Kimball, as I mentioned a minute ago, told the brethren that if anybody asks, the change came about by the Holy Spirit, but they don't talk about it. And if you look at some of the early biographies of the general authorities, I'm thinking of Mark Peterson's, which barely talks about it. His daughter wrote a book about her father that was published in 1985, barely mentions it. Let's see, Homer Durham wrote a biography of N. Eldon Tanner, his father-in-law, that was published in 81. Doesn't even mention the revelation at all. The second most consequential thing in church history, other than the lifting of polygamy, and Homer Durham doesn't even mention it. I mean, this is incredible. Well, and the declaration itself doesn't talk about the justifications that had underlay the ban for so many years, the curse, the pre-existence, all of that. It doesn't say anything about it. So the brethren are really, really worried that people will ask them, is this the doctrine of the church still, or has it been replaced? They don't want to get in the business of correcting their predecessors or correcting people who are still alive in the quorum, like Elder McConkie. And so the church is trying to move forward. They're moving into sub-Saharan African countries in the early 80s. They're moving into the Caribbean. They're going into places they'd never been before because of the ban. And they didn't realize that the racist books that were once accepted in the church would pose a problem because they're still in circulation. So Mormon doctrine is still in circulation. In fact, in 1979, there was another printing of it, and all of the rationales for the ban are in it. And
he essentially just cuts and pastes the text of the announcement into it.
He just puts the announcement into it. Otherwise, the same things from the 58 and 66 versions are still there. And I mean, he says some ugly stuff about race, that the interracial marriage is the subject of racial degeneration. This idea that the races mix and it's a degenerative effect. I mean, a whole bunch of things. And anyway, so the Doctrines of Salvation, Joseph Fielding Smith's 3-volume works that talk about the curse and all of that, they're still there. Answers to Gospel Questions. And the worst one, of course, The Path to Perfection. Or did I say that right?
Way to Perfection.
The Way, thank you. I always get President Monson's book. And
yeah.
Anyway, The Way to Perfection is still in print, which is the most egregious of the books with anti-Black racism. And there's a host of other lesser books that are still in circulation that talk about the curse. So needless to say, Black Latter-day Saints and White Latter-day Saints and Brown Latter-day Saints, they can go into Desert Book or BYU or Seagull or wherever else they sell LDS books, Bookcraft, and they can buy these books.
Written by apostles.
And the presumption is if I go into a church-owned bookstore, I can go in, buy the book, it's written by an apostle, and I can use it over the pulpit during my sacrament meeting talk next Sunday.
A very natural assumption, by the way.
Yes, I can use it as context for the lesson I'm supposed to teach. I can use it as a missionary as I teach Black and biracial, converts or prospective converts. So it creates a whole host of issues. The manuals are still full of this stuff. The Old Testament manual that was put together in 1981, it talks about favored lineages. And there's a theological paradox to all of this stuff, as I note in my book, that in 1978, August of 78, Bruce McConkie gives the most powerful address about the ban itself, giving details. It's a quasi-official account. To this day, it's the most detailed account by a church leader about what had happened. And he takes as this theme, 2 Nephi 26:33, that all are likened to God, a theme that nobody had ever talked about before 1978. So it becomes a branding message in the post-Revelation church. And Elder McConkie, on the one hand, is talking about that all races are equal in God's eyes. But on the other hand, he's still promoting this idea of favored lineages, that God has favored lineages, not recognizing that there's a fundamental paradox with the idea of favored lineages and racial equality. And so these things are still extant. And over the course of, say, 20 years, from the 1980s well into the 21st century, there is a host of Black and biracial and white Latter-day Saints who are pestering the brethren to get rid of these racially offensive books. And the wonderful owner of your store, my late friend Kurt Benson, whom we all miss so dearly, I asked him one day, I said, Kurt, I can't pin down when The Way to Perfection went out of print. You used to work for the Desert Book. Can you help me? And I figured if anybody could tease out a small detail like this, it'd be my good friend Kurt Benson. Kurt did some research, came back to me, and he said that the last catalog I have from Deseret Book, where I saw it, was in late 1989, and the next catalog in 1990, it was gone. So Kurt deduced that somewhere between late 89, early 1990, that book was pulled. And it was pulled without any fanfare. Nobody, there were no stories run in the church newspaper or church news. But when Bruce McConkie's controversial book, Mormon Doctrine, was pulled in 2010, there was a lot of stories about it, at least on the internet. And the Salt Lake Tribune ran a story about it. The Deseret News, not surprisingly, decided not to run a story about it.
And what was the rationale they gave, Matt? Why did it go out of print?
They said it was because of low sales.
How would we categorize that response, Matt?
Well, I'll tell you how I did it. So I saw it. I was doing, so I've done 2 books on this topic, as you point out, this one here. And of course, this is my latest one that I'm talking about today. But when I did the Mormon Church in Blacks, when that came out in 2015, I met with Mike Otterson of the church PR team, nice man. And I walked in with Peggy Fletcher Stack's story from the Tribune. I had it in my hand, and I read the part where it said that this is the Deseret News spokesperson, when asked by the Salt Lake Tribune why it went out of print, they said it was because of low sales. And I asked Brother Otterson, I said, you and I both know this is not true. And he puts his hands over his eyes. He's like, I wish we wouldn't have said that. And I said, hey, I'm not here to beat you up or play gotcha. I don't do that. I'm a scholar. It's just not what I do. So, but what I do is I need a statement from you and that I can put in my book about why it went out of print. And we talked for a few minutes and I said, I'll tell you what, I'll write it. I'll write the statement, a couple of 3 paragraphs. I'll say something about it's no longer dated. And I need you to approve it for me. He said, well, I can't approve it. It has to go up to the first presidency in the Quorum of the 12. And I said, that's fine. And he said, it'll take 2 months. And I said, that's fine. And so sure enough, 2 months later, the statement came back. The brother made a couple of light changes. Otherwise, they let my statement stand as is. But the deeper subtext was there were Latter-day Saints who were complaining all over the place, including Black Latter-day Saints. And because of these complaints directly to Sherry Dew, the CEO of Desert Book Corporation, they ultimately decided that it was not worth keeping, even though it was a best-selling book. And several people in the know had told me that off the record, that it is a best-selling book. And I wish, they could have saved themselves a lot of hassle, Desert Book, if they would have just, been open and said, look, the book was published in 1958. It's dated. It just doesn't represent the church's values today, which is something I wrote in my statement. And they would have been done with it. But they chose not to do that, regrettably.
Interesting. I just talked to a customer the other day here at the bookstore who asked, why aren't McConkey's books in print anymore? I smiled and I said, that's a complicated question. And that's actually a fairly good place to end the post-revelation discussion because it is complicated. And we haven't even brought up the name Randy Pott, star interviewer, or the race and the priesthood essay. So there's plenty more in the post-revelation era. And that's important because obviously the ban being lifted does not end the discussion by any means. Ask any Black Mormon. That definitely does not change everything. And that's part of the story that you tell there. So, well, Matt, this has been a fascinating interview. Just to remind people of the book we're talking about, Second Class Saints, come by at a benchmark. We're going to have you here actually July 3rd to talk about and sign books. So people can come to that. If they can't make it, you can order a copy online. You can get Matt to sign up for you to learn about this. And if you think this was a lot of stuff, this is just a taste. So many things. And this is the kind of book that even for people who are well-read in Mormon history, page after page, sources, stories, nuances to people, that will surprise you. It's an incredibly jam-packed, fascinating narrative. Now, Matt, you're not a person to rest on your laurels. This is definitely not your last book. In fact, you've got several well underway. Tell people, what else are you working on that we'll see?
The 2 books I'm working on now are biographies. I've been asked to do a biography for the University of Illinois series on J. Reuben Clark. I'm going to title it J. Reuben Clark, The Making of Modern Mormonism. And then Signature Books asked me to do a full-length biography on the late, great Hugh B. Brown. It'll be titled Hugh B. Brown, Progressive Apostle, Mormonism's Progressive Apostle. And I have had unprecedented access to the Hugh B. Brown papers. And that's going to be a remarkable story because there's so much to his life that the saints don't know.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time. Congratulations on an incredibly important, very, very good book. Buy it, people. You will thoroughly enjoy it. Thanks so much, Matt.
Thanks, Brian. I enjoyed my time today.
As an offering for my sins, a smoking incense, Brother Young, a blood atoning for my sinning, Brother Young. 'Cause I sinned so gravely, Brother Brigham, Brother Young. I have sinned so gravely, Brother Young, that only you can save me, Brother Brigham, Brother Young.
The song you heard today is called Brother Brigham, Brother Young by artist Corb Lund. Check out his music at corblund.com. And consider giving a donation to sunstone.org to support this podcast.